pretend we are in an alternate reality where Europa was on the Part 1 banner like she freaking should have. God, I am so pissed about that. Like, comment and subscribe.
Oh boy, I sure do like messing around with a new event on JP that has fun boss fights. Oh, Europa is being released 1 month early? Wait, that's only a week away? So as soon as you saw Europa on the Lost Spell 5 banner, you had 2 questions. Who in Christ's name is Europa? Well, we won't know for another 6 months, so good luck with that. Here's the second question. Is she good? Well, short answer, yes. But if you're here, you aren't here for the short answer. Here is the long answer. AoE writers. They've knocked on more doors than a Jehovah's Witness, and they get better tithes than Joel Osteen. Many of the 5-star ones are powerhouses that can fill both AoE and single target roles, be it from their beastly critical capacity or just their sheer NP damage. These guys don't suffer from the same issue that AoE sabers do. If you watched my Lakshmi Bai review, you would be aware of one of the biggest issues they have, which is a lack of good defensive options. Riders, however, get to have their cake and eat it too, as they can field both solid damage capacity and defensive capabilities. Each of the Buster ones have their own special field in which they excel. Drake is a good farmer that can get her NP very consistently with Pierce Invuln and crit spam on the side. Iskandar dishes out massive AoE damage, while also offering his teams plenty of strong offensive buffs. Ivan is pretty much everything. He has strong survival, consistent crits, buff removal, debuff removal, etc, etc. And then we have Europa. What role was left for her to fill? She is an absolute tank. Her shtick is living forever. Here's how. Her first skill is a modified version of Marie's Princess skill. 3 hits of Invuln on a 6-turn cooldown. It works pretty much the same way as Protection from Arrows, so you can cast it at the beginning of a fight and pretty much never risk it losing value. But it isn't just an Invuln. It's also debuff resistance. We're not talking about a silly little 50% for a couple turns. We're talking about a 100% resistance buff. It's also very unique in how it works. It is usage based, like with her Invuln. The next 3 times the enemy tries to hit her with one of those pathetic debuff skills that aren't guaranteed, they just bounce off. They don't wear off either. I've had fights where she had 3 stacks of them just sitting there unused at the end of the fight. Her second skill helps her with her mediocre NP gain. 30% battery and 3 turns of 30% buster and art's effectiveness buffs. It helps her card damage as well, since she has a saber deck. There isn't much to be said about the skill since battery is universally useful. Her third skill is kinda weird. It's an AoE charm with a defense debuff and a crit rate debuff. The latter 2 effects max at 20%, and the charm doesn't scale with a level. It's stuck at 60%. It's pretty much a direct upgrade over Shuten's first skill. Shuten's NP can increase the likelihood of her charm landing at least. This skill works very well in tandem with her first skill. Let's say the enemy has their NP. She already has her first skill active, so she will stay safe regardless. If the charm lands, her survival isn't jeopardized because the Invuln doesn't wear off. It also gives the team another turn for their survival skills to come off cooldown. But, well, 60% isn't that great. Not when pretty much every boss in the game has some sort of debuff resistance passive. Most of the time, you will be working with odds that are below 50%. At least there are enough bonus effects to make up for the unreliable charms. So just in her skills, she has access to a ton of defensive options. Hard survival with Invuln, debuff denial, crit chance reduction, and charm. What's left? Soft survival. This is where her kit gets a little weird. AoE Buster NP. It's overcharged as a 1-turn Buster buff, meaning she hits some pretty strong Buster chains with a total of 50% Buster up and 20% defense down. Pretty standard. This is tied to a static 50% defense buff. It only lasts for 1 turn. That level of a defense buff can allow her to face tank enemies' NPs reliably. Okay, so here's the part where we look at numbers. To absolutely no one's surprise, Iskandar tops this list. That's his thing, dealing huge damage. Aside from big damage and damage support, he doesn't have much. He doesn't have any utility that can deal with enemy defensive buffs. His NP gain is decent on its own, but he doesn't have anything to help him NP more. He doesn't have any survival options aside from a crit rate debuff on his NP. That doesn't reduce enemy damage though, it just reduces the likelihood of extra damage. Ivan has no reason to be this good. He doesn't hit as hard as a Skandar, but he has pretty much everything a Skandar does not have. He has hard survival with invuln, soft survival with an attack debuff, offensive utility with buff removal. By the way, that's all just one skill. He also has solid NP gain and a huge NP gain buff for 3 turns. He even has a little offensive support with his star regen buff and a buster resistance debuff that he inflicts with his NP. Europa hits decently hard. Keep in mind that she is the only member of her damage group that has not gotten an NP upgrade. I've already gone over what she has, so this is a good opportunity to highlight what she does not have. She doesn't have much in terms of support. Her first 2 skills and her NP only benefit herself. Her 3rd skill is the extent of her supportive capabilities. The charm is always useful if it lands. The issue is that when you use Europa, you'll use her against multiple enemies at once. If you fail to charm 1, then the uncharmed servants still may very well attack 3 times, meaning that the charm may not actually have value. She still has a little offensive support with a defense debuff, though it only scales to 20%. She also has some minor team defensive support with a crit rate debuff, but as previously stated, it just means you won't randomly take more damage than normal. She doesn't really have any offensive utility, it's just do damage and don't take damage. It's not a bad thing as long as she has plenty of other things to make up for what she lacks. And lastly, Drake. Drake is relatively straightforward. She has big battery, big NP gain, big Stargen, big, well, average NP damage. She hits only slightly below Europa. She offers some one-turn NP steroids for the whole team, so she synergizes with a secondary damage dealer. She also has some decent offensive utility with Pierce Invuln that lasts for 3 turns. Later on, she gets a little upgrade to her golden rule that helps her NP damage with a buster buff. She gets additional utility with an added defense Pierce buff. What do you do to make her work? Let's start with command codes. There are 2 basic ways she will be played outside of farming. The first is just general team play. Here you will probably want generic damage command codes on her buster cards. Crit codes are only worth it if you have faith in the star generation of the team. Trait-based special attack codes are generally a better option. Usually you just want NP gain on her arts cards. Her NP gain is mediocre. Without her second skill active, she suffers a bit. The Merlin command code is an easy recommendation. Sometimes though, you will have a bunch of battery flying around in the team, so it may be overkill. A secondary recommendation is Starbomb command codes. This way, you can generate some stars for your NP turn while ensuring that you will get your NP. Quick cards generally suck, so you can put whatever you want on them. Star generation is another good recommendation. Oh yeah, by the way, that's another issue she has, which may have already become apparent. She has the worst star gen out of all of the 5-star AoE riders. That being said, she gets a lot out of little, as she is a rider with rider star absorption. The second context is solo usage. Strangely enough, she won't be using Buster Brave Chains much if you're trying to maximize the value on her NP's defense buff. However, she will almost always be using one Buster card at a time. This makes it a very flexible card. If there's a specific buff the enemy is applying, you can put a removal code on that card. Most of the time she won't have issues with debuffs since she has that excellent debuff resistance skill. However, sometimes the enemy will spam a bunch of problematic debuffs, which would necessitate a debuff removal code. This doesn't happen often. You can also go for defensive options, like a heal code or the damage cut one. If you don't think you need any of the aforementioned codes, just do generic damage. Just don't use a crit code unless you're absolutely sure she will crit. Arts cards, pretty much the same story. You may find yourself foregoing the Merlin code for some more star gen though. Her quick card sucks, so you can just put the heal code down there and call it a day. Alright, supports. If your question is whether or not she is compatible with Vitch and Oberon, I'm probably not the right person to ask. Obviously, she is compatible with them in general gameplay. If you want to know what she can do in fancy reloading nonsense, look up one of the hundreds of tier lists for reloading and see if she is there. I am not the right person to ask about it. It requires one too many 5-star supports for me to put it into practice. So Hans is good for her because of the usual heals, stars, NP gain, or issues that she faces, and he helps fix those. No need to elaborate on his utilization when I do it in literally every review video. Qinggong is very nice for her. She has a bunch of survival. His taunt is the perfect tool that can take advantage of that 50% defense buff from her NP. With the second skill active, she gets 74% defense up with the 350 damage cut. If her third skill is active, the enemies will have a total of 50% crit chance down as well. The reason why his taunt is good is part of why I think other taunters like Leo and George don't work as well with her. She has so much innate tankiness that it is generally wasted if you focus too hard on keeping her from taking hits. Asclepius is a decent option for her. It's pretty much just his heal and NP gain support that help her. Her debuff resistance skill is very reliable, so she usually doesn't need help with that. The guts is also nice, but it's very easy for her to remain at high health throughout the entire fight. Fuma is a bit of a dark horse option for her. Why, you may ask? Obviously, because he is a servant specifically used for star generation, and that is all you need to get her to crit. No. Obviously, he has like 30 other things that are a lot more useful than 7 stars from an otherwise useless card. Fuma's third skill is very nice for her because of something that is always overlooked. This guy has a 100% debuff resistance debuff that he inflicts on the entire enemy team. Remember that unreliable 60% charm that Europa has? Oh, sorry, I mean 160%. The buff block can also be useful if the enemy has an invuln pierce gimmick. If you are faced with an NP that can wipe your Hans or Waver or whoever, he can evade them. Since Europa probably has her invuln up, she will be fine. Fuma can then cycle out for another support. Very clean, very safe. Their only issue is that their decks don't synergize at all. Usually when I do these support segments, I try to recommend easily accessible servants that best compensate for the weaknesses of the servant in question. However, Europa is different than the previous reviewees. She has very few gaps that are easily covered, so usually it's better just to focus on making her deal more damage. So what is there to say? Damage buff stacking isn't horribly complex, so I will leave that analysis to you, the viewer. Europa is an absolute unit with tons of good defensive options. Her damage is also pretty good. Her only issues are mediocre NP gain and poor star generation. These are issues that are very easily fixed with a plethora of battery supports and their various damage buffs. I will give her a 9. Her baseline performance without specialized support is very good. Her issues are negligible in most basic teams. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to click that cool red button below here. Please. Also leave a like, that'd be very nice too. Goodbye.